Another controversial issue, and of course this shouldn't surprise anybody, was slavery. Right? Now, first was the issue of whether slavery should be emancipated or not. Some Northerners seemed to favor the emancipation of slavery. But realizing that Southern delegates to the Constitutional Convention would simply walk out if the issue of slavery or the emancipation of slavery was even broached in the least, what ends up happening is that there's going to be a compromise again. So we will have no emancipation of slavery, and in fact, the African slave trade will be allowed to exist for another 20 years. During the American Revolution, the African slave trade had been outlawed. And what I mean by African slave trade is African people being enslaved and brought to America. During the American Revolution, there had been no fresh imports of enslaved Africans to America. And in fact, the net number of enslaved African Americans decreased during the Revolution because so many ran away to the British, or in the North won their freedom by fighting for the patriotic cause. So the number of African Americans is very much reduced. In South Carolina, they didn't think that they could possibly continue to grow rice without slaves. So they insisted that the African slave trade be reopened and remain open for another 20 years. South Carolina, who threatened that they would walk out of the convention if they were not given that concession, was able to reopen the African slave market, and the number of slaves that were lost during the American Revolution were quickly regained in South Carolina thanks to the newly reinvigorated and re-implemented African slave trade, which for the next 20 years would bring more and more and more African people into the new United States of America until 1808, when finally the Congress outlaws the African slave trade. But in the meantime, we have 20 years of continued and significant importation of enslaved Africans into America, perhaps the largest number of Africans who were brought into America at any period before the American Revolution, as South Carolina and to a lesser degree other southern states try and bring in newly enslaved Africans to America in order to try and make up for the loss they had experienced during the American Revolution. But an even bigger problem having to do with slavery had to do with representation. Southerners, of course, wanted to have as many representatives as they could in the House of Representatives. Right? In the way that you would designate the number of representatives that any state would get would be by taking a census. Right? For every X amount of people, you get one representative for your state. Well, Southerners wanted slaves to be counted in these censuses so that they would have even higher numbers of representatives. Now, Northerners were very much opposed to this idea. Why? Because it would enhance the power of Southerners. If slaves were counted in the census, and of course slaves had no political rights, so they would not be their desires, their political wishes would not be represented in any way at the federal government. But Southern white planters, their interests would be represented, and if they had more power, because you were counting the enslaved population to increase the number of representatives for Southern states, well, then the Southern states would have even more power. But the Southerners nevertheless insisted that slaves be counted in the census so that they would have more representatives in the House of Representatives. Northerners were very much opposed to this idea because they thought it would increase the power of the Southerners. But again, Southerners, and especially South Carolina, threatened to walk out. And ultimately, we get the 3/5 clause, meaning that 3/5 of the enslaved population will count for the purposes of apportionment. So, the more slaves live in a state, the more representatives that southern state will have, which will increase the power of Southern whites. Now, Northerners were very much opposed to this, but nevertheless, they ultimately had to go along with it, or the Southerners would walk. And whereas 35% of the conventioneers were from Southern states during the Constitutional Convention of 1787, the first House of Representatives would be comprised of 45% of people from Southern states. So you can see that the 3/5 clause, what it does is it greatly enhances the power, ironically, of slaveholders in the South by building up their population numbers by counting the number of enslaved people in their states. It enhances the political power of the South. And the South, really in the years leading up to the Civil War, will have much more political power than the North. In fact, every president, except for I think 4, was a Southern slaveholder in the years before the American Revolution. So slavery, of course, would be a real issue. And, really it's just kicking the can down the road, holding the wolf by the ears. In any case, that's the compromise, the Three-Fifths Compromise, and the compromise to not close the African slave trade until 1808. The last issue is, of course, the division of power. How much power are you going to allow the states to have? A large republic would break the power of the states and all the factions, right? And what people feared was that if the states had too much power, then the national government would wither. As a result, this Constitution greatly enhanced the power of the national government, and some Federalists, particularly Alexander Hamilton, imagined that the new government would kind of model these European states, which, like England, where the people had certain rights, but that the government was much more powerful than the federal government in America had been under the Articles of Confederation. So this thing was drafted. This Constitution was drafted. It was published in newspapers all around the country. And ultimately, what the conventioneers ask is for the American people to vote. But it's not going to be a simple up or down vote. What they're going to do is they're going to form ratifying conventions. Each state will form its own ratifying convention. And then that convention will vote whether they want to approve the Constitution or not. And once the Constitution is approved by 3/4 of the population, it will become the law of the land. One of the other problems of the Articles of Confederation was that for anything to get done, it needed unanimous approval. So having learned their lesson, the framers of the Constitution, what they say is that now we only need a 3/4 majority. And they are particularly interested in getting the larger states because once the larger states like Virginia and New York approve of the Constitution, they figured that the smaller states would come on board. It's a really difficult process getting the Constitution ratified. There had been no clamor for a new government. Mostly these were, property-owning principal men across the American states who wanted a stronger government to protect their property and to get the economy to recover and to make America look more serious in the eyes of its national neighbors. So the Federalists, as we might call these people who want a stronger national government, they submit the Constitution to ratification to all the states. But they have some ideas. First of all, they send the Constitution first to the states that they know will ratify it the quickest. So they send it to Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Georgia, and Connecticut. Delaware, New Jersey, and Connecticut, they were small states. They liked that the Senate gave them equal power at this higher house of the legislative branch. So they vote for it. Pennsylvania, which voted for it quickly, and so did Georgia, who Georgia always fears its security, so they want more security. They vote for it as well. And then it kind of starts to stall out. They can't get New York or Virginia, the two most populous states, to come on board and to vote for it. In New York, we see a real division between the city and the countryside. Artisans, manufacturers, financiers, bankers in New York City wanted nothing more than the ratification of the Constitution because they thought it would make America more secure. A stronger federal government would be able to pay off its debts. And New York City, which was a place that's primary economic activity was trade, they want this stronger government so they can start trading with the world again and be seen as a secure place to invest, a nation that pays off its debts. And even working men in New York City approved of this new Constitution. So much so that they even organized a parade. So we see is the Alexander Hamilton, a float which was constructed by working people of New York City in a parade which they held to try and convince their fellow New Yorkers to ratify the Constitution. But get outside of New York City, get upstate, and you'll see that a lot of people were very much opposed to the ratification of the Constitution. What you can see is that there was a very clear divide between cities and the countryside as to who wanted to ratify this Constitution and who did not. Country folk did not want to ratify this Constitution. They thought it gave the federal government too much power to tax, too much power over their lives, and they feared that their liberty would be imperiled by this newly enhanced centralized government, which is stronger than the one that came before. So they were the Anti-Federalists. The problem is it's much more difficult to organize political opposition out in the countryside. Yes, in the countryside it was much more difficult to get ratification, and it stalled out. We have Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Georgia, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Maryland, even South Carolina and New Hampshire agreed, but Virginia has not, and maybe even more significantly, New York has not agreed. Now, the Federalists, however, have a much easier time making their case because they have access to printing presses, right? And these newspapers can publish opinion pieces which argue for the ratification of the Constitution. The most important of these pieces are the Federalists, right? Look at slide number 15. The Federalist Papers were written by John Jay, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton. And they were all very much partisan arguments for the adoption of the Constitution. Federalist number 10 is very famous because James Madison says that, in fact, a Republican form of government will work very well in a large country. A lot of people thought that a Republican form of government, a government where the people had rights and had a say in their government, wouldn't work in a large country because it'd be too disorganized and caucus. But actually, what James Madison says is that no, a republic in a large government should work very well because, yes, people have many different ideas. And yes, people go to war when they disagree with one another. But in a large country, there's so many different people with so many different ideas, so many different factions, right? People who have different political ideas and oppose one another, that with so many different factions and so many opinions and so many ideas, which would be natural in such a large country, no one faction can dominate the others, right? This convinces a lot of people that actually, okay, maybe a republic can work, right? Especially in a country as large as the United States. It's never been tried before, but James Madison's argument makes sense, that there's so many factions in such a large country that they would keep one another in balance and no one faction could dominate all the others. He was not entirely correct about that because he didn't foresee that certain factions would ally with one another. For instance, Southern planters and Northern manufacturers would ultimately ally with one another and get majorities that way. But this idea that having so many factions and so many different political opinions in America would ultimately balance one another out was a convincing one. And it was one that convinced people that America might just work as a republic. Federalist number 51 is also very important because it argues that checks and balances between the different branches of government will prevent any one branch of government from having too much power and becoming tyrannical. So the Constitution divides power both at the stages of the national government, but it also divides power between the national government and the states. And the idea was that by dividing power both geographically between the states and the nation, as well as politically between the different branches of the government, no one area nor branch of government could come to dominate the others, and it would achieve balance. These are the arguments that the Federalists are making. They're convincing, but it's still a lot of work to get Virginia and New York to come on board, mostly because the rural areas in those very populous states are very opposed to the ratification of the Constitution.